ज्ञानतिमिरन्दस्य ज्ञानञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। गुरवे गौरचन्द्राय राधिकायै तदालये कृष्णाय कृष्णभक्ताय तद्भक्ताय नमो नमः। यं प्रव्रजन्तमनुपेतमपेतकृत्यं द्वैपायनो बलकातरया जुहाव पुत्रैति तन्मयतयोत्तरवो विनेदुस्थं सर्वभूत हृदयं मुनिमानतोऽस्मि। श्यामसुन्दरशखण्डशेखर स्वरहासमुरलीं मनोहरा श्राद्धकरसकुममक्षिपनिधे सुप्रियचरणकिङ्करीं कुरु। तवैवस्मि नादिवामि तया विना इति विज्ञाय देवी तं नमामि चरणान्तिकम्। First of all, I have my sustaining Dandavat Puspanjali, my heart like flowers thousands of times at the lotus feet of my holy master, my supremely worshipable spiritual Gurudev, Asmadeva Paramanadvatama, Guru Pada Padma, Nityalila Pravishta, Om Vishnu Pada, Ashtotarasata Sri Rupanugacharya, Srila Bhakti Vedanta, Narayan Goswami Maharaj. Secondly, I offer my pranam thousands of times at the lotus feet of my Param Gurudev to Srila Prabhupada and to all of our Sri Rupanuga Gaudiya Guru Parampara. And finally, I offer my pranam to all my dear spiritual brothers and sisters and to all Vaishnavas and Vaishnavis, Vaishnavis.
Shri Prem Prayojan Prabhu ki
So, by the causeless mercy of Sri Gauranga Gauranga, this morning we will continue with our seminar from yesterday morning on the subject of the complete synthesis of science, philosophy, and religion. So, just to recap on a few points from yesterday. There we go. According to Vedanta, the conclusion of the Vedas, the root cause of the material existence of every soul is Krishna Vimukata. That means turning one's attention away from God. And therefore, the only solution to all the problems of material existence is to become Krishnonmukh, to turn our faces once again towards the Supreme Lord. And so that movement of our consciousness towards the Supreme Lord takes so many forms, and those forms are the various angas, the limbs of bhakti: hearing, chanting, remembering, serving the deity, performing parikrama, engaging in service, and so on. So all the angas of bhakti are about centering our attention, centering our awareness on the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Supreme Being, Sri Krishna. Because when our attention is directed elsewhere, then what happens? We described yesterday the example that if you look at the sun, but when you turn away, then you'll have a negative after image, a blind spot in your vision. So when the living entity turns away from the Supreme Lord, then his consciousness becomes eclipsed by Gyan Abhav, an absence of awareness. And this gives rise to Brahm. A conditioned soul in this world cannot find the truth. He is helpless because he is afflicted with 4 defects. Brahm, Pramada, Vipralipsa, Karnapatav. You remember from yesterday. So the first one is Brahm, and this Brahm is the tendency to project that sterile, unconscious, unsupported non-existence onto the world, or unto himself. And so we are translating the word Brahm. Aspect of the word Brahm is mislocated hypostasis. Hypostasis means that to which we ascribe primary ontological value. This thing is the basis of everything. This is the most fundamental thing. So if we project the unsupported or self-existent, unconscious conception onto matter, then what happens? Then you become a materialist. You think that matter is the basis of everything, that matter itself is self-existent, requires no support, and therefore there is no need of any God. And on the other hand, because two things are known to us, only I am a subject and the world is the object. If we project this self-existent emptiness onto the world, then we become a materialist. If we project it onto the subject rather than the object, then the idealist philosophy comes about. So that can be summarized here. Sadrisha Brahm is located the hypostasis. When we think that matter is the most fundamental thing, then we'll consider that the mind or consciousness is a product of matter. The mind arises from the world. On the other hand, if you project that onto the subject, then you'll think that the world arises from the mind. And then all different flavors of idealist philosophy come about. But the truth of the matter is that, yes, the world does arise from the mind, but not your mind. It arises from the mind of God. So that is the middle point. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur describes how all philosophy, it is simply, there are extremes. Some philosophers are on the extremes of materialism or the extremes of idealism, and they're working their way slowly. If they're successful, they'll make their way to the center, where yes, the world is the product of the mind, but the product of the mind of the Supreme Lord. And so the world does exist, it's not unreal, and consciousness does exist, it's not an illusion just coming from a combination of matter. So that's the middle point, theism. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur describes that once we realize that the world has arisen from the mind of God, then everything around us becomes dematerialized. We see everything as the Supreme Lord's energy, but one of his energies is manifesting an eternal world, and another energy is manifesting a world full of temporary forms, like that. But ultimately, from the perspective of God, everything is spiritual. So, this is what we discussed yesterday. Then we discussed the consequences, historically speaking, in the 5,000 years since Srila Vyasadeva wrote the Vedanta Sutra, many other philosophers have come. And so he has not refuted those philosophers because they post-date him. But anyway, everyone falls into these categories, either materialism or idealism, or some shades between the two extremes. Now, if you look on both sides have severe philosophical problems. Perhaps you know that throughout history, all the great acharyas, like Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, and others, what did they do? They traveled throughout the whole country, meeting with all the leading intellectuals and philosophers and engaging them in debate, and then defeating them. And in those days, it was a matter of honor. If you were defeated in a debate, then you'd have to become the disciple of that person. And so in this way, Ramanujacharya traveled everywhere, eradicating the influence of impersonalism. And that really, materialism and idealism, they're two types of impersonalism. They're two types of nihilism, ultimately. So, and then afterwards, Madhvacharya, even more powerfully, began to travel everywhere, all over India, and refute the influence of Shankaracharya. So this is the occupation of the acharyas. They have a duty to travel everywhere and challenge all wrong ideas and eradicate them for the upliftment and the benefit of the world. So we are engaging with the ideas which are influential now in order to establish the correct conclusion of Vedanta. Now, here we are. Both sides, the materialistic side and the idealistic side, they have extreme systemic problems philosophically. But they're not recognized. Why? Because of Brahm. Philosophy is generally going on a discussion on the level of language. And language is really a second tier level of thought, conceptuality. But beneath language, there is a first tier consciousness that gives rise to our concepts. And so, Vedanta aims at that deepest, what is at the very root of all of our concepts. So, materialism and idealism, they have extreme systemic problems, which if one is just hovering on the level of language, it's difficult to deal with. But Vedanta completely uproots and exposes them. So first of all, we want to look at some of the problems of materialism, and then we'll look briefly at some of the problems of idealism. So, in the 12th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, Shukadeva Goswami speaks this verse. And I call this verse the atheist dilemma. The atheist dilemma. Here he's saying, Vikara kyayamanopi pratyagatmanam antara nari rupyostanu api syatsat chitsama atmavat. The essence of his argument in this verse is that because of our limited senses, we cannot know by empirical investigation what's at the base level of matter. We know that things are made of atoms and molecules, like even though you've probably never seen an atom. Has anyone seen an atom? Right? It's a concept in your mind. Right? So we have all these concepts and they're in layers, but no one came to the end of it. So someone may just throw their hands in the air and say, well, no one knows. No one knows. We haven't got to the bottom of it yet, so it's just unresolved. So let's just go and watch a movie. Oh, look, a chicken. People are in this, because after Brahm, the next level after Brahm is, what is that? Pramada, the inability to understand due to lack of attentiveness. So because people are in a state of distraction, even if they try to think about something, they can't focus for very long. They just get, oh, look, a chicken. They get distracted. So, it is not just a question that, we cannot know, we cannot find what is the last thing, what is the foundation of everything. Because Shukadeva Goswami is posing this idea. Even though you may not know, or may not be able to perceive or discover the very last final ingredient of the world, but we can say something about it still. What can we say? Either it has something with a form, or something that doesn't have a form. Right? Because there are no other options. Either the last thing is formless, or it has a form. So, here, first of all, see, Shukadeva Goswami says, Vikara kyayamanopi, meaning that the elements that the world is made of are transformations of the Prakriti. That means that the material energy in its most rudimentary form is a formless potential. This is the Vedic concept, that material energy in its most rudimentary form is a formless potential. In other words, it has no form. It's just a pure potential energy. And this was also the conclusion of Aristotle in Greek philosophy, that the basic ingredient of the world is, he called it prime matter. So we call it pradhan. It is just a pure formless potential. So, if the most foundational thing is a pure formless potential, then you would need a transcendental, intelligent, conscious being to actualize that potential into the forms of the world. Right? Just like if there's a lump of clay, we can say it's an ingredient in one sense. Of course, that's not formless. Clay has a characteristics, but just as a weak analogy, if there's clay, it can become a statue. But it would need a person with intelligence to take that which is potentially having an intelligible form and make it into that form. So in the same way, if the most fundamental thing is simply a pure formless potential, then the very fact that the world is filled with shapes would require a transcendental intelligent being to actualize the potential into the forms of the world. Right? So the atheist dilemma is this. He's got two choices. The last thing is either formless or having a form. If you say it's formless, then you must accept that there's a God, a transcendental intelligent being. So most of the atheists, they fall on the other side of the equation. They say, no, the last thing is something with form. It's like some kind of particle. The scientists are trying to break the atoms and find out what's the last particle. They have a concept called the God particle. They literally call it the God. We're trying to find the God particle. What's the last thing? And that is ironically actually true. So, but their idea of the God particle is something which is, of course, self-existent and unconscious as well, because they're materialist. Now, when we consider if the last thing, the most fundamental thing is a particle, then it will have to have certain qualities. So the first quality it will have is it must be self-existent. It's not dependent on something else, because this thing is that upon which everything else depends, if it's the most fundamental thing. The second characteristic that it must have is it must be akhanda, that is indivisible, right? Indivisible. Because if it were divisible into parts, then it wouldn't be the most fundamental thing. The parts would be the more fundamental thing. Okay? So the last thing, it must be self-existent and it must be indivisible. It must also be eternal. Because the reason things aren't eternal is because they're made of parts and the parts fall apart. Right? But if something has no parts and it's self-existent, and it's the foundation of everything, then there wouldn't be anything greater or more powerful or more fundamental than itself to interrupt its existence. Right? Okay? So now we have the atheist or materialist is saying, okay, the last thing isn't formless, it has a form, but this form is eternal, self-existent, indivisible. Let's go a little bit further. This form must have some kind of shape or characteristics because it's not formless, right? But the shape or the characteristic of it could not depend on any external forces because itself is the origin of all external forces. And therefore the shape that it has must be dependent only upon itself. So, that form, it must be either one way or another way. But what gets to decide which way it is? It cannot be any external force of nature. So, if we consider the nature of forms are either intentional or accidental. Just imagine you're walking on a beach and you see the sand dunes. And you just know that the sand dunes, their forms are, let us say, just relatively speaking, accidental because the wind was blowing. The wind was blowing, and according to the way that the tiny particles of sand were configured together, it made the shapes of the sand dunes. So you say this is an accidental form. In other words, the macro form is just the product or the aggregate of its micro constituents. And there was no intentionality involved in this, just the wind was blowing and it ended up in this way, by chance. But if you're walking along the beach and you see a sand castle with 4 turrets, and a door, and a moat around it, and a drawbridge, and some flags, then what do you think?
It was
The wind was just blowing. No, this is it's an intentional form. Now, consider this. Both the sandcastle and the sand dunes, these forms, one of them is intentional and one is accidental. But both of these forms are forms that have parts. So a form that has parts may be accidental or may be intentional. But a form that has no parts cannot be accidental. Why? Because accident means the force of external things has shaped it. So a form which is akhanda, which has no parts, cannot be accidental. It must be intentional. It must be the result of its own internal intention. Now, there cannot be intentionality without consciousness. Now look at the atheist dilemma. On the one hand, the most basic thing must be either formless or have form. If it's formless, there must be a God. But if it has form, there may not be a God. But that last particle must be eternal, self-existent, akhanda, partless, conscious, intentional. Wait a minute, that's sounding like God again. That's conceptually completely non-different from the notion of God, isn't it? So this is the atheist dilemma. Though we don't know what the last thing is, but what we do know, either it has form or it doesn't have form, and it doesn't matter which one you choose, you end up with the same notion. Either there's God, or there's this thing which is eternal, self-existent, conscious. And wait a minute, that's just the same as God. You see? So that's what Shukadeva Goswami is saying in this verse. He's saying that Vikarakyayamanopi pratyakatmanam antara, that even though all the elements of the world, they're a transformation of the formless material potential, atmanam antara, without reference to a conscious supreme being, then na nirupyospano api, you cannot account for any forms. You cannot even account for an atom. In other words, let's say that the basic energy is formless, which we do in Greek philosophy and in Vedanta. So God is necessary to make that formless potential manifest the form of an atom even. So you cannot even explain an atom without reference to God. If you take God out of the picture and say that the atom is the self-existent thing, then in the last line, Satyat Chitsama Atmavat. If you try to say that the atom is the primary thing, and here the Vedic atom means an indivisible, it's not like our Western idea of atom, it means a completely indivisible form, the most fundamental form which is indivisible. So if you say that the last thing is an atom, then Satyat Chitsama Atmavat, then your idea of what the atom is must be Chitsama, conscious, exactly like the supersoul. You see? So either if the energy is formless, potential energy is formless, you have to accept Paramatma, the supreme soul. And if you say, no, the most basic thing is the atom, then that atom ends up having exactly the same description as the supreme soul. An indivisible, conscious being with volition who is eternal and all-powerful. Must be all-powerful as well, because that last form is the basis of everything else. And all the powers that anything else has are all derived from that fundamental form. And so this is spoken by Shukadeva Goswami in the 12th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, which I've given the title, The Atheist Dilemma, because it gives the only two choices that they are, and they both lead to that God must exist. And so here we're identifying some of the systemic weaknesses in materialism. Materialism isn't an explanation. It's just hand-waving and bluster, and if you start to poke it and examine it, then it all falls apart. So we can come on to another aspect. Another problem that materialism has is called the symbol grounding problem. Symbol grounding problem is also known as the problem of intrinsic meaning. In other words, if you have a symbol, then the symbol represents something, but who decides what the symbol will represent? It always requires a conscious person to arbitrarily ascribe a value to any symbol. Otherwise, no set of symbols is intrinsically meaningful. So it's called the symbol grounding problem. How do you ground meaning into a symbol without consciousness? So this is a problem for materialism, because the whole idea of materialism is that our body is full of electrochemical signals which are going around the body and going to the brain, and then so they're encoded, the inputs are encoded, they're sent to the brain, then they're decoded, and then the lights come on and you're conscious, right? That's the idea of materialism. So it's all based on the coding and encoding. It's based on symbolism. That the brain is processing symbols, and by a complex processing activity, then an idea of it being an individual conscious person comes about. This is the materialist idea. However, because of the symbol grounding problem, or what is otherwise known as the problem of intrinsic meaning, there is actually impossibility of subject-independent encoding. Unless there's already a conscious being to attribute values to symbols, symbols themselves are not going to generate meaning. And meaning is not even consciousness. No? But consciousness is necessary in order to recognize and interpret meaning. So, let's look at this in a little bit more deeply. The reason why the materialist thinks that, the consciousness can just come from the brain, from some computer, like the brain is like a computer, is because they have pramada. First Brahm, then the next one, pramada, inattentiveness, the inability to focus and concentrate. The mind thinks only in gross ways. It does not notice its own heuristic thought processes. Because very often we don't think things through deeply. We have some heuristics, some shortcuts, some mental and intellectual shortcuts, so we can quickly arrive at the results. And so, due to inattentiveness, we cannot see the heuristics that our own intelligence is using and break them down into their fundamental parts. So, here's a question: where is the locus of meaning? What does that say? No, it's just some black squiggles on a screen. You see? It's just some black squiggles on a screen. But when you were a child, someone told you, this shape is ka, this shape is a, and this shape is ta. So you instantly recognize it. But there's no meaning in those squiggles. There's nothing. There's nothing there. It was decided by a social consensus. You see? There you are. So there's the real thing, the cat, and then there's the symbol. But the symbol has no intrinsic connection with the actual object. But we forget that. Let's say, if you're born in China, then there you are. You see? You know what that says?
Squiggles.
I don't know.
It says dog. In Chinese. You see, but because you're not Chinese, you wouldn't know that. But I could have fooled you all and said, this means cat. You see? And for the rest of your life, you would be walking around thinking that this character means cat. All of you. And the proof would be you would ask each other and confirm it, and you all confirm it to each other. And then one day you'll meet a real Chinese person and say, you're mad. Because the character for cat is this. You see, it's completely different. Anyway, the point is that symbols are arbitrary, and the locus of meaning is neither in the object or in the symbol. Where is it? It's in your consciousness. So matter, no configuration of matter can host meaning. And so the very fact that we are the hosts of meaning means that we are not material beings. This is the implication of the symbol grounding problem. Because we are the hosts of meaning, and we can give meaning to things which are otherwise meaningless. No? Therefore we are immaterial. We are not material beings. It's a proof by negative inferential insight. It's not a positive proof. It's just that all the alternatives make no sense, so you're left with that. In other words, we cannot be material, therefore we're immaterial. It's a negative definition of who we are. We say spiritual, but it means we're immaterial beings. So we can give another example. What does that mean?
Freedom.
Depends on who you ask.
Liberty. Green card. Whatever. Social security. So it could mean something. But really, you only know because you learned it. You learned it. Okay? So this is associated with that. Of course, that's another symbol, so we're going into an infinite regress now, but let's just take that's the land that you're sitting on right now. Okay? But there's nothing about the symbol that tells us anything about the object that it represents. You know? It could have been, and it actually was, the flag changed so many times before they finally decided, let's stick with this one. And then there was even a war over it, and the winners got to decide which is the flag. Right? So it's completely arbitrary. If an alien came from another planet and found a flag, they said, what is this? Is it a bed sheet? Is it a curtain? Is it a handkerchief? What is it? No, they wouldn't know. So the locus of meaning, there's meaning. It's not there.
Ooh.
It's there. Magic. So, but the thing is, due to pramada, the inability to concentrate and focus, it's a heuristic in our mind. When we see that flag, we say that flag means America, but it's a heuristic, it's a shortcut to communicate a particular idea. And so because of those shortcuts going on, we project and we think that meaning is in physical external things. But meaning is in the subject. It is in consciousness. And it cannot be hosted anywhere else. It cannot be hosted anywhere in matter. And this is why people think that artificial intelligence one day will become conscious. And then decide to take over the world. But ascribing meaning requires intentionality. It's my intention to do this. But matter does not have intentionality. So you can see in Jaiva Dharma, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur describes that the jiva, the living entity, he has two characteristics. One is anubhav shakti, that is the power to experience. Matter doesn't experience. Let's say if you make a robot, and if you turn on a red light and the robot says, I see a red light. Right? But it didn't actually experience, there was nothing that experienced anything. It was only like a reaction, one thing, another, input, output. But there's not just like dominoes. If you knock over one domino, it knocks over another and the last one will fall over. So pushing the first domino is the input and the last one falling over is the output. So there's no difference between putting on the red light, input, and then the audio coming, I see a red light. You see? It's just input, output, it's mechanistic, and there's no consciousness anywhere along the way. But because people, they cannot concentrate, because they have heuristics, they think that meaning and consciousness can be produced by matter, and then they have these fantasies that, the Terminator's coming to kill me, or something. That robots will rise up and become independent and have intentionality. And the inability to see the heuristics, the shortcuts, which are not true, but they're just useful in everyday life, is caused by Rajagun, the mode of passion in the mind. And so because 99% of all the people today spend their entire life jacked up on caffeine, so they cannot see the workings of their own mind, because they're always living a life and doing things that causes their intelligence to be in Rajagun, in the mode of passion. And so they lack the self-awareness and the introspection to see their own internal thought processes. You see? So this whole idea that consciousness comes from matter and materialism is just a product of first Brahm, and on the basis of Brahm, pramada, inattentiveness, the inability to think things through very finely with concentration. And this pramada, inattentiveness, comes from the mode of passion. And so, because practically everyone in the Kali Yuga is very much in the mode of passion, it's easy to make propaganda. There's that consciousness comes from matter and robots will be alive and artificial intelligence is conscious and these kinds of things. And everyone falls for it. They're very gullible. They are susceptible to that due to being in the mode of passion. And this is why, as spiritualists, we are very careful. We avoid meat, fish, eggs, any kind of intoxication, tea, caffeine, tannin, all of these things, which are stimulants and sedatives, because they cause the mind to essentially malfunction, the intelligence dysfunctions, and cannot come to the proper conclusion on anything. So there's the impossibility of subject-independent encoding. You can see here the basic idea today is there's an input. Let's say your hand touches something, and then the cells in your hand send a coded message through the nervous system. So the encoding is relayed. There's a transmission. It comes to the brain. In the brain, it's decoded and produces an output. And even if all of those things were possible without a conscious being, then even the output would need to be perceived. So the hard question of consciousness has still not been answered. But the very fact that there is a type of encoding in the body means there must be another conscious being who did the encoding. And so just the very fact of our consciousness and our interaction with matter implies from that we can infer our own individual consciousness is immaterial, and that the encoding which is there in matter must have been done by another conscious being, God, Atma and Paramatma. And so I'm going a little bit quickly, but if you deliberate on these things carefully, you'll see that just everywhere you look, if your mind is calm, the whole world is speaking the truth about the soul and the Supreme Soul. If anyone would like to challenge these ideas at the end, you're welcome. Do it. Knock yourself out. But before you do, I just want to say that this problem was identified. It was identified in ancient India. There have been debates about meaning. How is meaning, how does it come about? How do symbols, words related to their meanings? And so there's so many schools, the Vaikaran school of Bhartrihari, the grammar school of Bhartrihari. And then there's the Varnavad school of Kumaril Bhatta. And then there's our Vedanta school. So this discussion about meaning, symbols and meaning has been going on in India for thousands of years. But in more modern times, in the 19th and early 20th century, there was a philosopher, Franz Brentano, and he gave a name to this. He called it the symbol grounding problem, or the problem of intrinsic meaning. How can you have a set of symbols which are intrinsically meaningful without being parasitic upon someone who's already conscious? And you just can't do it. It's impossible. Actually, in artificial intelligence now, there are persons saying we've solved the symbol grounding problem. But the symbol grounding problem in robotics and artificial intelligence is not the same as the symbol grounding problem in philosophy. Because in robotics and artificial intelligence, it's just training a machine to be able to recognize something and then give it a name. And so the object and the name that it's given, that is all done by the machine. But that is not solving the symbol grounding problem. It's actually trivial. It's a different problem. Why? Because the machine itself that is doing this is depending on the algorithm, on the software. And the language of the software was made by a human being who attributed values to the symbols in the algorithm, like that. And therefore you haven't solved the symbol grounding problem. Why? Because it means, how do you have a set of meaningful symbols that are intrinsically meaningful, which is not parasitic upon a person who's already conscious? And so when they say that the symbol grounding problem has been solved in artificial intelligence, it just means that some robot with artificial intelligence can ascribe a name to an object because it has some sensors, some artificial sensors. It can do that, but that's dependent on the programming language. And the programming language, the symbols were dependent on a conscious person like that. So the solving of the problem in computer science, in artificial intelligence, and in robotics is actually trivial. It doesn't solve the problem of symbol grounding in the field of philosophy, because it's still parasitic upon a conscious person ascribing values arbitrarily to symbols, basically in the programming language itself. So that's a second tier solution. It doesn't answer the first tier question. Okay, so I'm just bringing that up because when this subject was framed or articulated by Franz Brentano, there was no such thing as artificial intelligence and all of these things in those days. But what he says still stands true on a fundamental level, on the first tier level. So he said, this is an entry from, just the Encyclopedia Britannica from 2 years ago. So it's a very modern entry. In the Encyclopedia Britannica it says, Brentano was deeply pessimistic about the possibility of explaining intentionality in physical terms. The ability to have intentions, it cannot be explained in physical terms, or you cannot reduce intentionality to the physical. Despite the concerted efforts of many philosophers during and since the 20th century, no one has succeeded in refuting Brentano's thesis. So that's just from 2 years ago in Encyclopedia Britannica, that no philosopher throughout the whole history of the 20th and 20th century up until today has been able to solve the symbol grounding problem in the field, not of robotics, in the field of philosophy. So if you'd like to challenge what I'm saying, go ahead, knock yourself out. All the greatest academics, doctors and philosophers throughout the entire world for over 100 years have not cracked it yet, so good luck to you. Because it's actually in principle, it cannot be solved in principle. They're just banging their head against the wall because they just don't want to accept that consciousness is not material. You see? Because they're committed to atheism, they're trying to solve a problem that in principle cannot be solved, only due to the commitment to atheism. And they cannot see why it cannot be solved because of, on the deep level of their consciousness, first Brahm, and on the next level, Pramada. And then on the next level, Vipralipsa, cheating. They don't want it to be true. Right? Vipralipsa. They don't want it to be true. And then the next level is, of course, the imperfect senses. So it's really fascinating when we apply the principles of Vedanta to the whole modern field of modern discourse. And you'll find that this is not some dusty old book from India, thousands of years ago, that's totally irrelevant today. Come on, it's the current year. Right? That's not an argument. It's absolutely as relevant today and tomorrow as it ever was thousands of years ago. So we'll move on a little. So just to summarize, we can say that there are actually no arguments for atheism at all. Why? Because anything an atheist said is a sentence. And if he's using language, then the language has meaning. And because meaning depends on consciousness, right? And there are two types of consciousness. Consciousness can either be self-existent or dependent existent. If consciousness is self-existent, that means it's the cause of its own self. In other words, its own desire, reality, immediately translates. Its own desire translates into reality. I want to be like this. So when desire translates directly into reality without any mediation, that's called omnipotence. Right? You desire something and it happens without any instrument in between. That's called omnipotence. It's the quality of God. You see? So whatever is self-existent, and really, according to Vedanta, there's only one self-existent being, and that's God himself. Because self-existent is consubstantial with omnipotence. Understand? If something is the cause of its own existence, it must be omnipotent. Because its desire translates into reality without any mediation. So consciousness can be of two types. If it's self-existent, it's omnipotent, or you can have dependent existent consciousness, which is not omnipotent. So for example, we're conscious, so we're not material beings, and we're not omnipotent. So we are dependent, existent, conscious beings. You see? But for dependent existence to exist, there must be self-existent. Because there has to be something for the dependent consciousness to be dependent on. You see? So because meaning cannot be hosted by any material apparatus, therefore we're non-material beings. Step one. And because we're not omnipotent, we're dependent conscious beings. That means there must be an independent conscious being. That's God. So just from meaning, you only take 2 steps and God exists. Just from meaning. So when an atheist speaks a sentence, it doesn't matter what he's saying. The very fact that he's using words and they have meaning that we can all understand leads directly to we are non-material beings, but because we're not omnipotent, we are dependent, so there must be an independent or self-existent conscious being. So every word that comes from the atheist's mouth in just 2 steps proves God's existence. Everything that he says. Understand? That's why I'm saying there are no arguments for atheism, because the very fact that the atheist is using language is just 2 steps away from proving the existence of God. So meaning directly leads to God. The fact that we're having a discussion means that you accept that we exist, right? So existence is either self-existent or dependent existent, either contingent or not contingent. So all the things we experience are contingent, so there must be non-contingent existence. So that's also God. So meaning leads to God, existence leads to God, consciousness leads directly to God, conceptuality. If someone's explaining something, they're using concepts. These concepts show that they have an intention to explain something. An intentionality is non-material. It can't be hosted in matter. And so the immaterial being, again we come to the same thing, is either self-existent or dependent. If it's dependent, there must be the self. So like that. So from conceptuality, just 2 or 3 steps we go directly to God. Intentionality, 2 steps we go directly to God. So far from the atheist explaining that God doesn't exist, every word and every sentence that he uses is only 2 or 3 steps away from proving that God exists, regardless of what the actual content of his words are. Now Vedanta will take this even to an even deeper level. In Vedanta it comes to the conclusion that even the actual words that the atheist is using are actually names for God. This will come at the end. You'll have to go through a few steps first before we get to that. So now we've discussed the materialist dilemma. Remember, on one side, either you become a materialist if you say that matter is self-existent. So we've refuted all the materialist arguments. Now let's come to the idealist side when you say, well, my mind is self-existent and everything is an illusion. It's all a product of my mind, idealism. So now we look at the idealist dilemmas, their problems. So the problem with this is, if your mind is the cause of the whole universe, why can't you control the universe? Right? If you're crossing the street and a bus comes and runs you over, if that bus was a product of your mind, why did you do that to yourself? It's insanity, basically. It's a state of insanity. If you see the world is a product of your mind, but you have no control over it whatsoever, then we have to conclude that it's not a product of your mind. Not either. It is not a product of your mind, and you are mad. Yeah, both of those conclusions lead directly from this. But you see, because the person is giving the primary ontological status, they're mislocating the hypostasis in their own, in themselves as a subject. Therefore, they're thinking, oh, yes, the way that I interpret the world is a product of my mind. That's true. And when they start to meditate, then they withdraw the consciousness from the world and enter into that awareness of their internal nothingness, and then think that that's the truth. So that leads us to the second problem. If you say that this nothingness within me is the truth, then why, you can explain, why does the illusion have the form that it does? We could say, I'm in illusion, you're in illusion, we're all in illusion. But why do we all see the same illusion? Why is the sky blue and the grass green? Why aren't we all seeing a totally different... Of course, we see the world from different perspectives. So there's some variations in the way that we see the world. But if someone's run over by a bus, then he has the experience of being run over by a bus, and everyone who's watching sees that he got run over by a bus. It's not like a totally different reality. You see? So we see things slightly different due to our vantage point. But still, the laws around us, the way that things are going on, there are regularities in nature, and we all see, and they're common to all of us. Otherwise, there would be no possibility of science. If there were no regularities in an objective world, then science would be impossible. Because the performance of an experiment depends on the fact that if I do this experiment today, if I do it tomorrow, it will yield the same results. And someone else can verify that my experiment was correct, because the regularities in nature remain the same. So science would be impossible if the world were just a product of my mind or your mind, and we all produced it in a different way. Right? Because I do the experiment and the result will be a product of my mind, and you do the experiment and the result will come out different because your mind is different. Right? So we can, even if you say the world is an illusion, it's a product of your mind, but that doesn't explain why does this illusion that you're talking about have these regularities which are verifiable between all of us. If you say that reality is ultimately formless and it's all an illusion, in fact I'm you and you're me and we're all just one soul, then why does the illusion have the shape that it has? This is the theory of Shankaracharya. Is also a subjective idealist. Also, you can see in Buddhism, Madhyamic Buddhism, Nagarjuna, they have the idea that everything is empty, everything is void, and all thoughts and all variety, it's all simply illusion. So, to such persons, we can ask 4 questions. The first question is, if the world is an illusion, who is it that who is in illusion? Because you're saying the reality isn't a person. So something which is not a person can't have a personal experience of being in an illusion. Right? To be in illusion, you have to have an individual personhood first to experience an illusion. If you say that the light of Brahman is an illusion, then Brahman is one, there are not two. It can't be like part of Brahman is an illusion and the other part is still in enlightenment. That means the whole of Brahman becomes an illusion. That would make the illusion superior to Brahman. Because they impulsively say, oh, you're an illusion, but I'm enlightened. Okay, but if I'm Brahman and you're Brahman, how come one part of Brahman is enlightened and the other part is an illusion? You see? Because you told me that Brahman has no parts. It has no characteristics. So that's the first question. Who is in illusion? They cannot give an answer. And then the second question is, okay, I'll give you a miracle. I'll give you one miracle for free. Brahman can be an illusion. Or some part of it, even though it has no parts. Let me give you this miracle. Some part of Brahman can be an illusion. That my question is, what is he confused about? If only Brahman exists, if only the light exists, then there's nothing for him to be confused about. So how did he become confused? Then the first question is, okay, I'll give you 2 miracles. First of all, some part of Brahman became confused, which is impossible. I'll give you that miracle. Secondly, there was something else that exists for Brahman to be confused about. I'll give you a second miracle. So then the third miracle is, you see, the example that the impersonalists give is this. They say that illusion is just like you're in a dimly lit place and you see a rope hanging from a tree, but you think it's a snake. Oh, it's a snake, and you become full of fear. But when you become enlightened and realize it's not a snake, it's just a rope, your fear goes away. So enlightenment is like that. Everyone's afraid in this world, but when they become free from illusion, then they'll be free from fear. They'll realize it's not a snake, it's a rope. But the thing is this, that the illusion of taking a snake to be a rope depends on two things. The existence of such a thing called a rope that has characteristics, and the existence of another thing called a snake, which has characteristics which are similar to the rope. Because if there weren't such a thing as a snake, which is similar to the rope, then you couldn't have that illusion, right? You wouldn't be walking along and see a rope hanging from a tree in the dark and think, that's a toaster. That's a washing machine. It's about to jump on me from the tree. Yeah? Why? Because there's no similarity between a washing machine and a rope. The only reason you go into illusion is because these two things have forms and their forms are similar. So if you say that only Brahman, the light, is true and the world is an illusion, what's the similarity between Brahman and the world by which you go into this illusion? So there cannot be any point of similarity between a formless thing and a thing that's full of variety and form. So then we'll say to them, all right, then we'll give you 3 miracles. We'll give you the miracle that Brahman can be divided and one part can be an illusion, another part not. We'll give you another miracle that there's something other than Brahman that even you don't accept, that made Brahman become confused. We'll give you another miracle that the formless thing could be mistaken for a thing that has form. 3 miracles I'm giving you. So now my question is, why do you bother to do sadhana? Why are you doing a daily practice to become enlightened? Because when you mistake one thing for another, you do the mistake by accident. Right? So that means if Brahman and the world are similar and you can mistake one from the other, you became an illusion by accident. But just as you can mistake a snake for a rope, you could mistake a rope for a snake. Right? The other way around as well. And so that means that there's no sadhana by which you become enlightened, but rather you should become enlightened just by accident. Or even if you become enlightened, then you could again come in illusion by accident again. If you can mistake Brahman for the world, that means you're in illusion, then you should be able to mistake the world for Brahman as well. And so then you'd have just people randomly becoming in illusion and randomly becoming enlightened by mistake all the time. Right? So the entire philosophy of idealism or impersonalism is completely insane. But due to a lack of concentration, due to not being able to think clearly, then persons, they easily fall for this. Oh yes, everything is one, it's all the light, the world is an illusion. It's convenient because it frees you from responsibility. Because as soon as you accept there's God, now you have a responsibility to God. You have to do something. You see? So it's people accept these philosophies out of vipralipsa, the cheating propensity. They don't want God to be true because they don't want the responsibility that it entails. Because once we accept that there is such a thing as God and He's created this world for a purpose, our purpose is to realize Him, then we actually have to do something to realize Him. We have to accept our corrupt state and engage in the practice of spiritual life to propitiate His grace upon us and become reformed and restored to the pure spiritual platform, you see. So, we've discussed, first of all, how indifference to God gives rise to Brahm, mislocated hypostasis. Whichever way you do that, it makes you materialist or idealist. We've shown the complete implosion or deconstruction or the internal inconsistencies in both the idealist and the materialistic viewpoints. And therefore, we must at least come to the center. That there are 3 things. There is the physical world, ourselves, the individual souls, and the supreme soul from which both have come. And that basic structure, we call this the theological structural realism. That is the foundation of every religion in the world. Whether you are Islamic or Jewish or Christian, any theistic religion of the world or Hindu, whatever, they have that basic structure. 3 things are real: God, His creation, and the living entities. These are Brahma, Jiva, and Jagat. So the whole discussion of Vedanta or metaphysics in Indian history is also just discussing proving these three things and the relationship that they have with each other. Right? So that basic structure, Jagat, Jiva and Brahma, the world, the living entity and the Supreme Lord, that is the universal structure of religion everywhere. So the various religious people all over the world, that is their meeting point. That is their point of commonality. We can all come together and agree on this. Because from that platform, there are many different, let's say, policies about what is right and wrong and how we should live and how we should organize society for every soul to have their best chance to evolve and grow in life. They're all common to every religion. So there's no need to quarrel over various details which came about by historical processes. But this basic structure of the living entity, the world and God, that is the commonality which is there for everyone in all religious life. So I was given the position of the president of Interreligious Dialogue in the BRICS International Forum. You know BRICS? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now there's 6 or 7 more countries have joined. So it's BRICS Plus. And so there are meetings, political and cultural meetings around the world. So in those meetings I go and I present this philosophy here, because what is needed is that the people from various cultures and backgrounds, they must recognize this scientific commonality between everyone who is theistic. First, theism is wrong and it's very bad for everyone and for society. And secondly, we don't have to argue over, very fine, hair-splitting doctrinal, theological doctrines. Just to know this basic theological structural realism is enough to interact in a peaceful way with each other and try to encourage everyone to evolve in their God consciousness. Because there's only one God and there's only one religion. That religion is love. That is bhakti. Bhakti means devotion to God. So this world is like a prison for the souls, actually. Or let us say, an educational establishment. Yeah. It's a rehabilitation center. Right? The world is, and there's the souls and their God. And we become released from that rehabilitation center and enter into the divine realm of the Supreme Lord. That is our purpose, through devotion. And so this is why Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has said, Bhakti Yoga is Jaiva Dharma. It's the intrinsic nature of the Jiva. It's the intrinsic nature of the soul. So it's not a question of this faith or that faith or this faith or that faith. Scientifically speaking, Bhakti Yoga is Jaiva Dharma. It's the very intrinsic nature of every single soul. Doesn't matter who you are or where you are in the world or even in other planets. That is the nature of everyone. So, now, moving on to the next subject. So, it is only the unsteady mind that causes oscillation between materialism and idealism. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Swami Thakur said that when we turn our awareness away from God, our awareness becomes overlaid with an adventitious awareness, which is characterized by thoughts which are inconclusive and contradictory. It's a very beautiful expression. You can remember this sentence of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Swami Thakur. When the soul turns his awareness away from God, his awareness becomes overlaid with an adventitious awareness. That is, it's not intrinsic to himself, it's a covering. And that adventitious awareness is characterized by producing thoughts which are one, inconclusive, in other words, unfinished ideas, or contradictory. No, I came to a conclusion, but when you examine it, it's completely contradictory internally with itself. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur has a very precise, beautiful mode of expression of all of these philosophical ideas. So, if I see devotees are taking photos of the screen, if you want the slides, send me an email, I'll send you the slides. Learn the lecture, go and give this lecture yourself. In the universities and here and there, anywhere. I want you to take this with you and run with it. And just eradicate from the surface of the earth all atheism. So, just coming back to the our two lists historically of all the various philosophers of materialism and idealism, and some of them are not at the extremes, some are more closer to the center. I just want to interject here, and you'll see there you are. There is an updated version of that slide, and in the middle we have classical theism. And so Gautam Rishi in ancient India, he was the father of the logic school. Gautam Rishi's Nyaya Sutras. So the logic school also, through logic, they have their own methods. They have 9 different ways by which they prove the existence of God. So then you have Socrates, also Socrates, and because we have nothing written by him, but we have the testimony of Plato. So Socrates said God is the summum bonum. The summum bonum. That means the totality of the good. In all things, there may be a degree of goodness, but that universal goodness, which is the totality of everything that is good, that is God. So that was Socrates or Plato's idea. Then Aristotle argued for things are in motion, but everything is moved by something else. So that chain of cause and effect must begin with a prime mover. So for Aristotle, God is the prime mover. In Sanskrit, we say adhikarta, the original actor, the first agent. Adhikarta means the first agent. So you'll see a lot of commonalities between the classical theists and our Vedanta as well. But there's something in Vedanta you won't find anywhere else. We'll get there slowly. And then on the basis of Aristotle, then Saint Augustine, who is the main theologian in Christianity. He was really a Neo-Platonist. And then in Avicenna and Averroes, they were the main Islamic philosophers from the golden age of Islam. I believe Averroes was from Andalusia, right? Both of them. Okay. He's from. His father is from Andalusia, and he's born in Morocco in this land, but living a lot in Andalusia. So what is now southern Spain, Andalusia, was under Islamic control during the golden age of Islam, and the Islamic philosophers, Avicenna and Averroes, actually they were deriving all of their natural theology from Aristotle. And then Maimonides, also in the Jewish religion. His name was Moses Maimonides. The Jews have a saying: from Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses. Right? And that's a reference to Moses of the Old Testament and Moses Maimonides of the great philosopher. And he was also basing his natural theology completely on Aristotle, on the classical theology of ancient Greece. And then Thomas Aquinas in Christianity, also completely based on Aristotle, but we can say that he also developed the system further. He refined it. So the basis of Christianity for 1,000 years, the philosophical, natural theological basis, was what is called Aristotelian Thomism. Aristotelian Thomism. The interpretation of Aristotle that had been extended and refined by Thomas Aquinas. So, and then when the Enlightenment period came, then the classical worldview was jettisoned. Not all at once, but gradually it was jettisoned. So it's quite ironic that the Enlightenment was really the opposite of Enlightenment. It was a wrong turn. For society, it was a wrong turn. It's like, check your GPS. No, you have to go back. So you have to rewind a little bit. You have to go back at least to the classical theistic worldview, and then from there it's just a step to go to Vedanta, to go somewhat further. But it's definitely an improvement on the modern materialistic, reductionistic worldview. Now, let's come back to our theme again of science, philosophy and religion. So what I want to do in the next, how much time do we have?
As much as you like.
Huh?
20
As
to
much as you like.
As much as you like.
20 to 1.
Yes.
Eternity.
I like, but how much can you digest in one sitting? So I don't want to give you indigestion. Just take something. Huh? I think in the evening, because everyone's more fresh, in the evening we'll discuss more direct, not metaphysics, but the sweetness of bhakti and the pastimes of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and the pastimes of Krishna. But if we don't finish this today, I think on Monday in the morning, then we can complete the other, if there's anything left over. Okay, so what we want to look at here is just see these three disciplines, science, philosophy, and religion, as we discussed, they're not really in contradiction with each other, but rather science is really the philosophy of nature. Philosophy itself leads us to natural theology, and religion has natural theology plus revealed theology, that which descends by grace, that which is revealed through the scripture. So this is the reconciliation between the three disciplines. Now, science is not clearly understood by people today. Rather, they inject into their interpretation of the scientific methodology their own illusory vikalpas, non-correlated thought constructs. In other words, if someone says that science proves that there's no God or science is atheistic, that means actually they're not dealing with just a pure scientific methodology, but they've somehow arbitrarily injected some metaphysical principles in there which are not there in the data. I was in New York the other day and I was walking to a park chanting japa, and I saw someone was walking past wearing a t-shirt that tickled me a little bit. His t-shirt said, "That's not very data-driven of you." So, so what happens today is, if you take the scientific methodology and then you take that to be proof of atheism, then that is not actually science. That is what is termed as scientism. Scientism. It's a fanatical or arbitrary interpretation of science, which is actually not based on the data, but based on, in many cases, inadvertently, accidentally, injecting one's own psychological values into the subject, into the interpretation, and thinking, well, that's what the science says, just in the same way as you would look at a flag and say, it means America. Right? It's a projection of your own consciousness into the data, where the data doesn't really say any such thing. In the classical world, the natural philosophy, that is the examination of nature, leads us to the fact that God exists. And so, because science is essentially the philosophy of nature, science also leads us to the conclusion that God exists. It's not that you can do an experiment, and prove and find God. Oh, we found him. We made our telescope 1,000 times more powerful than the Hubble telescope, and now we saw this big eye in the sky was looking at us. Right? That's never going to happen. Because God is the Advait Gyan Tattva, is the non-dual conscious reality, and unless we transcend duality and come to the state of non-dualism, then we'll never realize God. This is the mistake of thinking that when I'm studying a subject, I collect some information, and so my knowledge is growing by the collection of data, and if I just keep going and keep collecting, I'm going to get to the end of knowledge. I'll find God. Don't think that God is somewhere further down that path of empirical investigation. He's not, because that is in the plane of duality, in the plane of bodily identification. So the absolute truth is not further down the road in the materialistic method of accumulating knowledge at all. It's another method entirely. It is not avarohapanta. Sorry, it is not arohapanta, the ascending process. It's a descending process to know God. So, but what I want to look here is at three worldviews. We'll call the modern worldview, and that is the milieu or the climate in which we were all born and raised and educated. And even though all of us here, we believe in God and we believe in the Vedas, you'll be surprised when we discuss this, how much your thinking is still influenced by the modern mechanistic and reductionistic worldview. And so even though, let's say, you're on this side of the equation, in the Vedic side of the equation, you may come to understand that you are still very much conditioned in your thinking by the entire atmosphere of this particular age. So in discussing the faults and the weaknesses of the modern worldview, it will very much free you and give you a deeper understanding of the Vedic worldview. Now, the classical worldview is quite different from the modern worldview, and we can say that the modern worldview is a type of corruption or breakdown or abbreviation or contraction of the classical worldview. So you cannot really understand what is the nature of the modern worldview, because everyone thinks that the way I think is, well, everyone thinks like that. It's obvious. I'm impartial. Everyone feels like this. So we cannot see, it's a blind spot, we cannot see it, the nature of our own conditioned thoughts without comparing it to something that's different. So the classical worldview and the modern worldview is, when you learn about the classical worldview, you'll see your own conditioning. And so it's very liberating in that sense. And from the classical worldview to go to the Vedic worldview is just another step. To go from the modern worldview directly to the Vedic worldview it's a bridge too far. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to do. Even Vyasadeva in the Vedanta Sutra doesn't try to bring anyone directly to Vedanta. He approaches Vedanta through the comparison with all the classical Vedic schools, Nyaya, Vaisheshik, Sankhya, Yoga, Purva-mimamsa, like this, gradually. So each person can understand the limitations of their own thinking before they approach Vedanta. So what we're doing in principle is exactly the same methodology of Vyasadeva. Not coming from where we are now directly to Vedanta, but through intermediate steps. Then that journey will be successful. So right now you may be thinking, well, I'm talking about this theoretical philosophy which is up there somewhere and not so relevant to me. But as you go through these concepts, then you'll see that it's actually, there's some heart surgeries taking place. That this is actually a type of therapy. That you're now actually in therapy. And some healing is going on. And so many internal adjustments and changes will take place. So don't think what we're doing is something irrelevant and it's about ancient Greeks and medieval Christian theologians and stuff like that. It's actually about you. So 3 steps: the modern worldview, the classical worldview, and the Vedic worldview. I want to define what I mean, so to make sure we're all on the same page. By the modern worldview, I mean the idea that everything in the world is a mechanism. It's mechanistic. In other words, it's coming by the push and pull of different parts acting upon each other. And so one of the corollaries of the mechanistic worldview, of the mechanistic model, is reductionist view. That if you want to understand something, you have to take it apart and see what's under the hood, right? If you want, the only way to understand something is to reduce it to its parts, and then you'll know it. And therefore, generally people think of the world as being atoms and the void, or matter and motion. And even if someone believes in God, then they have an idea that God's up there somewhere, but this world is like mechanistic. As we mentioned yesterday, the deist idea that the world is a clock. God is like the cosmic watchmaker. And he made a clock, he wound it up and put it down, and now he's doing his thing, and we're all left to our own devices. You see? So even you can be a theist, but that's a modern theism. It's not a classical theism. because the mind is still thinking in mechanistic and reductionistic ways. So it doesn't mean that there aren't any mechanisms in the world. But the mechanics of things, that model is not comprehensive. It doesn't explain everything. Okay, so that's the modern worldview. Now, the classical worldview, that is the worldview of the philosophy, theoria, and we can say that either Plato or Aristotle, they are the foundation of all the religious views, the philosophers in Judaism, in Islam, in Christianity. And you'll find that Gautam Rishi in ancient India, his ideas are very, very similar to Aristotle. In fact, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has written an article where he shows which Greek philosophers, Heraclitus and Pythagoras and Socrates and Plato and so on, were influenced by which Indian philosophers. Because there was a time in ancient times where there was a lot of osmosis of ideas between India and Greece. Because perhaps you know Alexander the Great. He's called Alexander the Great because he was conquering every country all the way to India. And he conquered northern India. And so northern India, there was a period called, where there was a civilization called the Greco-Aryan civilization. Greco-Aryan civilization. And they found coins from that civilization, and the coins have Greek on one side and Sanskrit on the other. Ah, very interesting. There's so many.
Didn't they find an archaeological dig where a lot of those people died?
Yeah, there are the main archaeological sites for the Indus Valley civilization are Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and now they're both, after the partition, they're both in Pakistan now. But the largest one was discovered, and it's only about 120 miles from Vrindavan, called Rakhigarhi. Do you know Rakhigarhi? And this is the biggest archaeological site, if you want to look into that. Wow. I don't want to go too much off the subject. So, I'm just saying that the classical worldview was there in Greece, and also among some of the sages in ancient India. And there was a time when they were very closely connected. And in fact, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, when he was very young, the first book that he wrote was called the Poriadi. And the Poriadi was an epic poem, and he wrote it in English, and it's about the life of King Porus and Alexander the Great. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur wrote this epic poem in the style of Milton in English, about the interaction between the Aryan culture, Vedic culture of India and the Greeks. Perhaps you know the story when Alexander the Great came through, he was conquering so many states, because India wasn't one country then, it was very many small countries. So he was conquering one after the other. And when he conquered King Porus, and King Porus was captured and he was tied up, and then King Porus was put before Alexander the Great, then Alexander the Great said to him, "So, how do you want me to treat you?" And King Porus was all tied up. He says, "Treat me like a king." Even though he was defeated and tied up, but he still did not give up his Kshatriya spirit. So then Alexander the Great, he appreciated that. So he told his men, "Untie him." And he said, "All those countries that I conquered on my way here, you'll be my representative there. You should rule over them." So though he was defeated, he actually became the king over a bigger kingdom than he had before, because he was deputed to rule over those areas by Alexander the Great. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, when he was a boy, he was very touched by this history, and his very first book was a poem in English on this subject. Yeah, you can read it. You can send me an email. I'll send it to you. So I'm going off the subject again. This will take a long time, the way we're going. So, we're discussing the modern worldview, characterized by mechanism, reductionism, and then the classical worldview, which is characterized by the belief in the existence of God, based on coming from the world and intuiting things called forms, that there are forms or universals, and that's the intermediate between God and the world. So we'll talk about that more later. And then the Vedic culture, Vedanta. So these are the three stages. You want to go from one to the next to the next. As a type of therapy to cleanse ourselves of the contamination of the age in which we were born, raised, educated and influenced. Okay, so Vyasadeva, the scholars say about 1000 BC, but we say in our tradition 3000, about 3000, more than 3000 years ago, he gave Vedanta. Aristotle was, it seems, influenced by the theory of universals, or in Sanskrit they call jati, that was developed by Gautam Rishi in India. And that theory of universals was very prominent in the teaching of Aristotle. Then Averroes, we mentioned, the dates of Averroes, the Islamic scholar who based his natural theology in Islam upon Aristotle's classical theory. Maimonides, there we are, in the Jewish religion. Thomas Aquinas, here are all their dates. It's very important when I'm giving lectures in the international forums, and there are Christians, and from the ambassadors are coming from the Middle East, and the ambassadors are coming from the Islamic countries, Christian countries, and so on. So now let's have a look at the classical worldview. The classical worldview that leads to theism is based on the idea that you haven't explained anything completely or properly until you have accounted for four causes. So we'll just give a very, just a crude, rudimentary idea about four types of causes. The four causes are formal cause, ingredient cause, instrumental or efficient cause, and final teleological cause. These are the four causes. So a general example could be given. Let's say we're considering a house. You see a house and you say, well, what's the cause of this house? So first of all, then you can see there must be a cause of the form, because the form of the house could be, you can see in the street, every house is completely different. Right? All the houses are completely different. So there must be a cause of the form. And so here you can see there's the architect's diagram there. So there's the plan of the house made by the architect. But only having a plan for the form is not enough. You need some ingredients to make the house. So the ingredient cause, in a general sense, we would say that's the wood, the bricks, the glass, the actual things that it's made out of. That's the formal cause. And then you have the instrumental cause. Just a pile of bricks and wood is not going to build itself. Yeah. So you need an actual instrument that will put them all together and turn the ingredient into the form that it's meant to be. So that is the instrumental cause. Yeah? And then finally, the final cause. That is also called the teleological cause. The telos. What's the ultimate purpose of the house? What's the purpose? The purpose is that Sarah will live here. Maybe there could be a higher purpose. Sarah will invite so many devotees from all over the world to have a festival. Right? So this is the nature of final cause, or telos, teleology, that there are hierarchies of purpose. So things can have an immediate purpose. Like your legs, they have a purpose, it's for walking. But why do you walk? You walk to the supermarket, right? To get some food, so you can put food in the stuff so you can stay alive. But why do you stay alive? So that you can, or whatever, do all the things that you do. But the real purpose of staying alive is to discover God. And so everything has a purpose, but it has immediate purpose and intermediate. There's a hierarchy of purposes. So in Vedic life you have Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, Prem. These are the Purusha Arthas. The word for telos or purpose in Sanskrit is Artha. Objectives of life. Okay? So these are the four causes. Is that clear to everyone? If you want to explain something, you haven't explained it properly or completely until you've explained the four causes. Okay? So that's a very crude explanation. It's just basic, but understand that for now. Now, the next thing is, this was the idea in the classical period, throughout the medieval period, even during the Renaissance period, even though during the Renaissance there was a somewhat of a shift away from theology to more naturalistic themes, humanistic themes. But then when the Enlightenment came, science came about. But what is science? How did they come to that? So one Enlightenment thinker who is considered in many ways to be a father of the modern scientific worldview was Francis Bacon. And in 1605 he wrote a book called The Advancement of Learning. In The Advancement of Learning he says that natural science doth make inquiry and take consideration of the same natures as philosophy. He's saying that philosophy and science investigate the same thing. What is this world? However, but how? Natural science is only as to the material and efficient causes of the world, not as to the forms. Understand? He's saying that in science, in philosophy, we're trying to answer the question of four causes. He's saying, but science means we're only dealing with the ingredient of things and the instrumental. How did this ingredient come about, or how does this ingredient act instrumentally upon other things? You see? I'll give another quote just to consolidate that fact. Please note it down very carefully. Here's another quote. It's from his book in 1620. 15 years later, he wrote another book called Novum Organum. And there Francis Bacon is saying, let the investigation of forms, which are eternal and immutable, constitute metaphysics. And let the investigation of efficient cause, that is instrumental cause, and matter, the ingredient cause, constitute physics. So here he's giving a definition. All right, you all know about philosophy, that is metaphysics. Metaphysics is about four causes, but now I'm saying we have a subject and it's just called physics. And it's not the four causes. Let's just bracket off the two outer ones, the formal cause and the final cause, and we just left with the ingredient cause and the instrumental cause. In other words, what are things made of and how do they interact with each other? How are they instrumentally effective on each other? Is that clear? Should be clear in your mind? There are four causes, and that is metaphysics, the area of philosophy, the classical world, and it led to the inference, by inference, that God exists. Now he's saying, what is science? We're not going to talk about the formal cause of things or the ultimate purpose of things, the final cause. We're only dealing with the ingredient and instrumental, how things affect each other. Okay? So that was his idea, and thus physics was born. Now we can say that physics is the foundation of all the sciences today. For example, let's say you're a psychologist. So the psychologist is not going to take the approach that we have and say that, well, the mind is a subtle material energy and it's being moved by pran. So if you do pranayama, you can steady the mind and solve your psychological problem. But today the psychologist will say, well, the mind is a product of the brain. The mind can be reduced to the brain itself. And therefore, psychology becomes reduced to biology. And biology becomes reduced to chemistry. And chemistry becomes reduced to physics. So, you see, that's why we're talking about metaphysics became physics, but this physics is actually at the foundation of all the thought processes, all the way up to the social sciences, all the way up to sociology and all of those things. You see? Before we go on, I just have to make sure that's clear. Do you have a question?
Yes, Gurudev. I'm just getting a little confused about the idea of forms being eternal and immutable.
Because you don't know the classical philosophy yet. But it's because you are still thinking as a product of your education upbringing. So let me just say, Oh, there's a graphic just to illustrate what we just said. 4 causes. What is the modern worldview? The formal cause, cross it out. We're not going to deal with it. The final cause teleology, we're not going to deal with it. Science, or specifically physics, which is the root of all the various sciences, will be, let's give a tick, to the ingredient cause and the efficient or instrumental cause. These 2 causes. And so we have a concept now, basically like atoms in the void. We have particles that are all bumping into each other, and that's going to be the explanation of everything. Okay? So, now, let me explain a little about the classical worldview. In the classical worldview, if it's understood properly, you cannot make this reductionism. You cannot reduce metaphysics to this idea of physics. You cannot do it. It's a complete mistake. And I'll tell you why. Let's look at the ingredient cause. What we told before about the 4 causes was just a basic child's introduction to the subject. It was an approximation. It was a crude explanation. And so what happened at the time, we could say Francis Bacon himself, he wasn't properly educated in the classical worldview. He had a crude understanding of it, because you cannot reduce the 4 causes to 2 causes. It's impossible. Why? I'll tell you why. Let us say the ingredient of the house, it's made of bricks, right? But the bricks are not an ingredient. Why are bricks not an ingredient of the house?
Because they had to be made.
Because the bricks themselves are made of something, right? The bricks already have form. So then you have to say, well, what are the bricks made of? And you can say clay. Is clay the ingredient? No, because clay already has form. So anything that you say, it's the ingredient is this, then you also have to say, but what's that made of? And what is that made of? And this is why Aristotle, and also in the Vedic, because the Vedic is a revelation, but the Vedic revelation, it also concurs with, or is congruent with, just a logical inference here. That you have to say that the ingredient of everything is just a pure formless potential. Because as soon as it's something, that something has a form. Right? And then you have to say, well, what's that made of? You see? So by logic, you come to the conclusion that the ingredient of everything is a formless potential, but also by revealed theology, the Vedas also tell us that the ingredient of everything is just a pure formless potential. So now, to make that pure formless potential manifest as an actual tangible object, now there has to be a formal cause to actualize the form, the potential energy, and bring something into existence. And so in the classical world, the ingredient is just pure energy, pure potential energy, and the forms, they exist in transcendence. Let's say, perhaps you heard of Plato's cave. Have you heard of Plato's cave? It's very famous. So the analogy of Plato's cave, there are some people and they're chained to the wall in a dark cave. They were born there. They were born in captivity in a dark cave. And there's a wall in front of them. And behind them, there's a fire, a light. And some people, they have some shapes. And there's a wall behind them with a fire. And some people have some shapes on sticks. And they're moving them like this, above the wall. So what happens is the light is shining and the shapes are casting shadows onto the wall. And the people in the cave are looking at the shadows on the wall and they're thinking, this is life. They're just thinking that it's life, but it's an illusion. Then one day, a person broke out from his chains and he climbed out of he was under the ground, and he climbed out of the cave and he came out into the world. And at first when he came out into the world, he couldn't see anything because he'd been in the dark for so long. Just being in the normal daylight was blinding for him. So then after a long time, his eyes adjusted and he saw the beauty of the world. And he thought, this is amazing, this is fantastic, I'm going to go back and tell everyone. So then he went back into the cave and he said, I'll free you from your chains and come with me. There's a world full of color and variety and beauty. And they all said, you're mad, get out of here. You can understand how this is an analogy for a prophet or a saint who has gone beyond the shadows of this world and seen the spiritual world. And he comes back and says, you're all suffering here, you're all chained up in prison looking at shadows. Come to the real world. And they say, no, how can I live without my chains? How would I stand up if the chains were holding me against the wall? You see? So this is a teaching of Socrates. It was written by Plato, but he received his teaching from Socrates. And the idea is that the forms of this world are reflections of the divine forms, eternal forms in the spiritual world. And so even though every form in this world just comes and goes, it's based on an original form. So we have the idea of Goloka Vrindavan. So there the grass is green and the sky is blue. So here in the reflection the grass is green and the sky is blue. That's the explanation of the form of this world, because this world is a reflection of the spiritual world. That's stated in the Brahma Samhita. Srishti Sthiti Pralaya Sadhana Shakti Eka Chayeva Yasha Bhuvanani Vibhakti Durga. Durga, Maya Devi, the material energy, has created, maintained and destroys this world, which is Chayeva. It is a reflection, it is a shadow of the transcendental world. And she creates it according to the will of Govindam Adipurjam Tamam, according to the will of Krishna. So in our Vedic philosophy, the origin of the forms of this world is the spiritual world. In Gautam Rishi's Nyaya, it is very similar to the system of forms of Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle. And that is, they say that, let's say, in this world, if there's a man, or there are many men, each man is the individual or particular instantiation of the one original form or universal man. You see? If there are 10 apples, each apple is a particular instantiation of the one original form of apple. So even though the individual instantiations come and go, but the universal remains. And that's why you asked this question. When Francis Bacon says, we're not inquiring into forms which are eternal, we're just inquiring into ingredients and their effects on each other in this world, you see. So in the concept of the classical philosophy, that if there's a horse, there are many horses, each individual horse is the instantiation of one universal or jati. In Gautam Rishi in India calls it jati or universal, you see. So, but the difference, let's say, between Plato and Aristotle. Have you seen the painting, The School of Athens? Do you know that painting? Oh, just someone type it into their tablet or something. Just type in The School of Athens. It's a famous painting by Raphael. You can see it in the art gallery at the Vatican. And basically there are many, many philosophers in this huge painting. In the middle, there's Plato and Aristotle. And Plato's finger is pointing up and Aristotle's finger is pointing down. And the reason Raphael painted them in this way is because Plato says that the universals are real and they exist in an eternal realm beyond this world. So the Christians who were Neoplatonists, they said that the forms which are eternal, which are the cause of all the forms of this world, their origin is the mind of God. And so, because the thing is about form is that form is not continuous, it's discrete. That means if something is continuous, let's say you make a graph. If you make a graph of acceleration, then you'll think that the car is going through all the speeds between 0 to 60 miles an hour. It's passing through all of them, so it's continuous. But if, let's say, if you're walking up steps, then it's not continuous, it's discrete. There are discrete steps, like this. So form is not something continuous. There's no continuous line between formlessness and form. It's either formless or something has form. So form is discrete. And therefore form can never come about by a process of incremental steps. It must just come as it is. And therefore the forms must be from the mind of God. In other words, God, an intelligent being, conceived of them and then has brought about the combination between the potential energy and the eternal forms, and then you have the forms of this world. You understand? So just the very fact that formal causes must exist means that there must be a God, because form itself is not continuous, it's discrete. A lot of philosophical terms here. Do you understand? Many people are nodding, so I'm feeling optimistic. I'm feeling optimistic that you understood why form itself means that God must exist, because form is not a continuous quality like acceleration could be. In the Vedas, it's also the acceleration is not continuous because time itself is in fractions. So that's another story. But it's imagining mathematically that the acceleration is continuous. Okay, so form itself being discrete and not continuous means that all forms must be already made in the mind of God before they're manifested here. This is also another philosophical point. Okay, so does that answer your question now? I just wanted to say, what's the difference between the forms of Plato and the forms of Aristotle? For Plato, his philosophy has been called by later philosophers as exaggerated realism. That means he says that the forms have their own eternal existence in another world. Exaggerated realism. So realism here just means that the forms are real things. And then for Aristotle, it's called a more moderate realism. He doesn't say that the forms of things in this world exist in their own world anywhere, but rather they only exist when there's a combination between form and the potential energy. When they're combined together, an object actually exists now. Now we can speak about the form that exists. Before, the form is also just like a potential. It's not located anywhere. It doesn't have a location. So in Gautam Rishi's Nyaya Sutras, Gautam Rishi says that the universals, the jatis, there is, let's say there's one jati for man, there's one jati for woman, there's one jati for horse, there's one jati for apple. And these jatis, they exist, but they're everywhere. Each jati, each universal exists and it's everywhere, it's all pervading. And then when a man is born or an apple grows or something, then that jati which is everywhere becomes instantiated in that particular apple, like that. That's Gautam Rishi's idea. It's close enough to, it's very close to Aristotle, and it's quite close to Socrates and Plato also. But Socrates and Plato are more, let's say, pointing up to another world, whereas Aristotle is, when he speaks of metaphysics, he's speaking about the forms of this world. So his philosophy is called hylomorphism. Hylomorphism means that everything is a combination of two things, potential energy and form. And when these two things come together, then you actually have an existing object. Understand? So now, so you raised this question, you asked for that. So formal cause. So this modern scientific reductionistic worldview is that we're not going to deal with formal or final causes, we're only dealing with the ingredients and the efficient cause. What are the problems here? The problem is that when the modern person is thinking of the ingredient, he's actually thinking of something that already has a form. Right? He's not thinking everything is made of a pure potential energy as we do in Vedic philosophy or in the classical world. He's thinking, oh, the ingredient of this thing is such and such a chemical or a molecule or an atom and so on. But that already has form. So in his mind, he got rid of formal cause, but he didn't. What he did was he crudely redefined what the ingredient is to include formal cause. I want to say that Francis Bacon, he was a theist. He believed in God. He did believe in God. It wasn't his intention to deny formal cause or deny teleological cause. He just said that science is, we're not going to deal with those two, we're just going to deal with these two. But then what happens after many generations of science, people forget what those things even are. They forget what they are. And because they're essential steps to understanding that there must be a God, when you forget what those essential steps are, then belief in God also disappears. Understand? The breakdown, the gradual corruption of the intellect that took place from the medieval and classical time through the Renaissance. Then the Enlightenment came. The Enlightenment just came. Oh, there is God. We believe in God. We believe in formal cause. We believe in final cause even. But science is we're going to bracket these two off and just deal with these two. And then when science starts to produce many miracles, let's say, such as electricity and communications and aeroplanes and telephones, and then people, they're not so interested in going to church or the seminary and studying philosophy anymore, because we can make money out of this stuff. This is amazing. I can write an app on my computer in 10 minutes and then sell it online and become a millionaire in a few weeks. You see? So because of the illumines, because of the promise of science, then people focused on science, which was dealing with two causes, and they completely forgot about the others. But those were the keys that lead us intellectually to the fact that there must be God. Now, this breakdown, this corruption of the intellect was unnecessary. It was completely unnecessary. And the reason is that you can have science, but what you must not do is redefine the four causes. He accidentally or inadvertently separated them. But the truth is they cannot be separated. So let's look at why. The fallacy of reductionism. Let's look at why you cannot reduce everything to ingredient and instrumental cause. So if you look at the four causes again, the ingredient must be prime matter. It must be pure potential. It can't be something that, like a molecule or an atom or an element, it can't be something that already has a form. Because you will ask, well, what is it made of? So the ingredient can't be the things that science says are an ingredient cause. You cannot remove the form. So prime matter is a pure potential. In Sanskrit, it's called pradhan. Prime matter, according to Aristotle, it's pure potential without form. And for something to exist, it has to be connected, it has to be combined with a universal or a jati. Now for us in Vedanta, the original form of gross things is what? The samskars, impressions in the chitta. Impressions in your own chitta or impressions in the universe. Let's say, for example, you've got many impressions in your subconscious mind. When you die, you give up this body, then Prakriti enters just like a mold. If you're making something from plaster, the plaster is liquid and you have a mold, you pour the plaster into the mold and then it sets and becomes a particular statue, right? So in the same way, when you die, you give up this gross body, and then according to the samskars in your chitta, then the pran enters into that and it solidifies and becomes the various elements: earth, water, fire, air. Oh, the other way around. Ether, air, water, fire, in that order. And so your gross body is a grossification of pran, which has entered into the mold of your subconscious mind from the previous life. And that's why you're this shape, and you're this shape, and we all have different shapes. Why? Because the bodies that we have are the solidification or the grossification of Prakriti, the material energy, according to the shape of our sanskars in our subconscious mind from the previous life. Understand? This is why in Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna says, Yam yam vapi smaram bhavam chadyaptyanti kalevram tam tam evaiti kontaya sada tad bhava bhavita. Whatever you think about at the time of death, you get a body exactly like that. In other words, what's the shape of your chitta at the last moment? You give up the gross body, and then the elements according to the shape of your chitta solidify and bring about the body that you have now. So there's a sutra that directly says that in the Yoga Sutras. It's Jati Antara Prakriti Puryat. It means Jati Antara. Jati means your birth. The word Jati means universal as well. So your form, your Jati, The form that you get, the formal cause, the form that you get is due to the entering of Prakriti into your samskars, and then it gradually grossifies, solidifies, and then that's called your next life, your birth in the next life. So, ingredient is not the bricks. That's a crude idea. Ingredient must be pure potential. So, form must be something other than that. It must be something transcendental to that. Now, we just said the form is your sanskars gives form. But the shape of your sanskars is based on what you've experienced in this world, and this world is a reflection of the spiritual. So, ultimately, the form is, if the roots of form is something transcendental. You see? So the formal cause is something transcendental, and it's already a whole. It's a whole thing. Then, instrumental cause. Instrumental can be that instrument that brings together the potential energy with the formal cause to bring something into existence. Or it can be, once something came into existence, that object can act upon other things. You see? For example, now you have a body, and your body could push another body. So now your body becomes an instrumental cause of the movement of another body. Like this. So, formal, ingredient, efficient. Now, final cause. This is something very profound. We said in the explanation of final teleological cause, ultimate purpose, that the reason the house was built is for the owner of the house to live there and enjoy their life. Or maybe even make a bhakti festival there. Right? Okay? So, but that is not a complete explanation of the subject of telos, or final cause. So now, concentrate very carefully. In its most rudimentary form, the final cause, or telos, is the power to produce an effect, or a range of effects. Think of it in this way. Here's a ball. Another ball comes rolling along, and when this ball hits the second ball, what happens? Well, we know, we can predict it according to the velocity and the weight of the ball and the weight of the other. We can calculate. You will hit it and the other one will bounce off. But why? We're just conditioned that happens all the time, so we don't think about it. But what it means is this, that if the ball were rolling along and when it touched the other ball, why don't they both just turn into a bunch of flowers? Why doesn't it just pass through it? Or why doesn't one go up and one go into the ground? Why does it act in this particular way? Because the surface of that form has a power to produce a particular result or a range of results. This is very important to understand. This is the fundamental idea behind formal cause. It's not just what is the person going to do with the house in the end. It's actually down in its most rudimentary form, the power to produce a particular effect. Now, why is this important? The reason it's important is this, that if we misunderstand the ingredient and formal cause, and we say the ingredient is the brick, yeah, then we'll say that the brick, let's say the brick hits the ball, the reason the brick produces a particular effect is why? Because of the structure of the brick, the parts that the brick is made out of. And that's the answer to why. Let's take something like carbon. If you have carbon, if graphite is very soft, you have graphite in your pencil, and you just rub the graphite on the page and it leaves letters there. But if your pencil had carbon in the form of diamond, then it would just cut the paper. It would cut it. Because it's very hard. It's the same thing, carbon. But why is one soft and one hard? Because of the structure, the arrangement. You know, the graphite is arranged in hexagonal shapes in layers. So when you rub it on the page, the layers rub off and they leave some carbon on the page, so you can write with the pencil. Whereas the diamond, the atoms are arranged in a tetrahedral configuration. And so they're very strong. They won't let go of each other. They're not in layers. They're all connected very strongly. So you can say that the reason that the brick produces an effect is because of the arrangement of its constituent parts. Right? That's the answer, isn't it? Isn't that the answer? the brick hits the ball and the ball bounces, the brick has the power to produce this effect because of the arrangement of the atoms, and it's so they're arranged in a hard way. That's the answer, isn't it? Well, everyone will say, surely, yeah, that's the answer, and they're happy and they go home. But the problem is this, that you haven't answered the question, you've just relocated the question on the next level down. Because if you say that this force is produced by the parts that it's made of, then you just say, well, how do the parts produce the force that produces the next force? You see? And then you will say, well, because of their parts. And then you say, well, how do they produce the power? You see? So now you can't get out of this. But one thing you can do is, if you just keep going and going, then you say, we don't know. So, but if you know that the final thing is a formless potential, then you cannot blame the power to produce effects on the parts. And therefore, form itself is defined as the substrate of causal powers. In other words, the effect is not coming from something, some hidden thing inside down there. It's coming from the form itself. It's a totally different way of thinking. It's a completely different way of thinking. I'll give you an example. Let's say if you've got a machine, it's made out of so many small parts. And let's say a car is moving. So you take the car apart and you can see this part is moving, this is moving, this is moving, this, and you can get down to the last part and the fire, and then ultimately you'll come to a pedal and there's a human being putting his foot on the pedal, right? Because not everything needs a prime mover. Nothing will move without some conscious being behind it, ultimately. But you can understand how it works by breaking it down. Okay, so that means that from the smallest part, from the micro constituent up to the macro form, there's what is called upwards causation. There is upwards causation. The micro constituent acts with the other parts, and those causes and effect go up, 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 up until the macro form. And then on the surface of the macro form, its power to produce effects has its result, has its cause in the aggregate of all the effects of the micro constituents. That's upward causation, from the small to the big, right? So the form itself is not the cause, but some micro constituent of the form is the cause. That's called upward causation. Okay? Understand? So, and it's okay if you're just dealing with cars, but when you're dealing with reality, we find it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. If you take a living thing like a human being, and say, well, we're just all the products of the parts. Okay, get all the parts, put them together and make a human being. Let's see you do it. You can't do it. Why? Because the actual organization of the parts is done by pran. And pran is not gross physical. It's subtle physical. And that's organizing all the parts. And the pran is connected to the soul, is actually drawing the pran towards itself by its own desire. This is described in Bhagavad Gita. Prakritistani karshati. All these things I'm saying you'll find in Gita, if you understand the Sanskrit terms very deeply. So what you have with a living being is that the form is greater than the parts. The form is greater than the parts. Just like if in neuroscience, if a person has epilepsy or something, then the scientists can actually shut completely one part of the brain. One part of the brain, completely. And all the functions of the brain are then done by just one side of the brain. Well, mechanically speaking, you can't explain it. If you have damage to one small part of your brain, you can become paralyzed and you can't move. But you can switch off complete half of the brain and everything is still functioning. Does that make sense? But this is a scientific fact. What is happening? Because the actual functioning of the brain is done by the movement of pran. So if there's one part of the brain isn't working, that means that part of pran isn't working, then part of the body becomes paralyzed, right? But if you mechanically just shut down one side of the brain without injuring the pran just reconfigures itself and does all the functions in the other side. You see? So this is actually a proof that pran is the organizing principle in a living biological organism. And that's why something which is dead, you can't bring it back to life. Because you can never make the parts self-organize without something more subtle, which is organizing in the prana. That's why Srila Prabhupada would always challenge the scientists. He would say, okay, if there's no such thing as spirit, just take something that's dead and make it alive. No one can do it. Okay, just create 1 grain of rice in your laboratory. You can't do it. All right, okay. There are thousands of cows, they're producing milk every day. Here's some grass, make it into milk. You can't do it. You see? Because all of these biological functions, they're actually done by prana, it's not even spiritual. It's a subtle material energy, but there's no prana unless the Atma is there. Because the prana and the Atma are always together. That's why the gopis say, oh Krishna, Krishna is my prana. Gopi paranadana. Mat prana natastu saeva na para. Because the prana and the soul are always together, and the soul can't do anything without the prana. You see? So, what we're discussing here, the modern mechanistic idea is you can understand everything by breaking it down, and then you'll know all about it. But actually with living things, you can't do that. Because the total form is greater than the sum of the parts. Because actually there's something subtle behind it. There's the prana and the soul, which is organizing. And another thing is, even if a materialist said everything is matter, then what happens? You say, well, what is that matter? And they go down, and now you come to the realm of quantum physics. So what do they find in the world of quantum physics? They say, oh, it is just a field of uncertainty, right? Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It's just, hello? Aristotle's calling. Now, the scientists are saying that the fundamental matter is just a field of potential, right? And then that potential, the wave of potential, it collapses and becomes one option or another option. You know, there's wave-particle duality and everything. So it's very confusing to the scientists. They can't understand. But it just turns out that the mechanistic Newtonian physics, which we think in terms of and which applies to the gross world, that mechanics doesn't apply in the micro world. You have to have a new type of, they call it mechanics, like quantum mechanics. But it's not really mechanics in the same sense. Because they think that everything is a field of potential. And some persons say that when consciousness interacts with it, then it becomes one thing or another. Just like, you know, Schrodinger's cat. Raise your hand if you know Schrodinger's cat. Yeah? So is Schrodinger's cat dead or alive?
Yes.
Well, according to Schrodinger, then you don't know whether he's not dead or alive, but he's in both states at the same time. It's just a pure potential. But then when you open the box, then you'll either be dead or alive, right? So that's it. But it's ridiculous. Of course, the cat. If you don't look in the box, right? But you teach the cat to send you an SMS, right? You said, "Get me out of here! I'm dying of a radioactive poisoning," right? So this whole physics is just insane. But hello. Aristotle's calling. You see, Aristotle thousands of years ago in the classical era said the basis of matter is a pure potential, and the potential becomes actualized by forms, and that leads to the conclusion that there must be God. Okay, and now the scientists, after rejecting Aristotle in the post-Enlightenment period, getting rid of him and saying everything's mechanistic. Lo and behold, they discovered that, wait a minute, everything isn't mechanistic at all. It only appears to be mechanistic on the surface, but deep down, it's not mechanistic. And so we have this thing that instead of upwards causation from the micro constituent to the macro form, there's such a thing as downwards causation. In other words, the form itself is responsible for the organization of its micro-constituents. You see? So a human body is like that. The human form itself, due to the prana of the human form, is organizing all the micro-constituents. If the soul will leave, all the physical atoms are still there, it's a dead body and the whole thing breaks down and it has no organizing principle anymore. So Srila Prabhupada would always challenge, life comes from life, not from matter. Life comes from life. You see? Now, so just see how important it is to really understand ingredient cause, formal cause, instrumental cause, and final cause. If you try to reduce it only to ingredients and instruments, and those two also have been redefined in a crude, childish way, right? Then you end up with a mechanistic worldview, and everyone from their childhood is so conditioned by this. I can see on your faces as you're listening, your eyes are going. And you're realizing that even you being devotees and dedicated to God, you're still thinking in mechanistic upward causation. You're thinking always of upward causation, mechanism, reductionism. That's the conditioning of the age. But before the Enlightenment, this thinking wasn't there. There was the classical worldview, where you can have downward causation. And so the form itself can be the cause of its internal organization, and it is also, the form itself is the substrate of its powers. Remember, the ball is hitting the ball. You cannot say the cause is the parts, because even the scientists, they go down and they find there are no parts there. You see? So then you have to say, where does this power to produce effect come from? And it is in the form. The definition of form is that which is the substrate of causal powers. Understand? Form means that which is the substrate of causal powers. So just as form itself cannot come about by incremental degrees, it has to be as it is because it's discrete. So because form is discrete, and because form is the substrate of causal powers are also discrete as well. So just as form must come from the mind of God, causal powers also come from the mind of God. They cannot be produced, they cannot be reduced to just the crude idea of ingredients and instrumental cause. They cannot be reduced. So the powers of everything, they're called Shakti. Shakti means the powers of God, and these powers are invested and given by God. Shakti Sanchar. It means God has invested everything with particular powers which are irreducible to micro-constituents. But until you get out of the modern mechanistic worldview and into the classical worldview, that's just incomprehensible. So just make the shift from the modern reductionistic, mechanistic worldview into the classical worldview, and then you'll understand that there must be a prime mover, an original cause, and an origin of all forms, that is in the intelligence, in the mind of God, and all the powers of all things have been directly invested by God into those things. They cannot be explained away by mechanisms. You see? Shakti Sanchar.
Causal powers are discrete. What does it mean?
Did you understand continuous and discrete? No? I'm not going to go back there. You read. Sorry. Here again, the explanation of continuous and discrete. So, here, the final cause, there's some other technical terms here. I'm not going to go into them today. Let me choose. I have to choose a suitable place to bring this part of the discussion to a close. No, discrete means something that doesn't develop in a continuous way. Just like, I gave the example, acceleration. If you're accelerating, you go through every speed between 0 and 60 miles an hour. Like that, theoretically. We also don't agree. But in mathematics, they say like that. So that would be a continuum. Would be a continuum. But something which is discrete, it only exists in particular values with no gaps in between. And so form itself is discrete, because there's no incremental stages between formless and form.
Your body would be discrete, right?
Every form is discrete by nature.
So does it mean that it has definable form? I mean, definable edges, definable...
That's one feature, but what it means in this comparison between discrete and continuous is that it cannot come about by incremental steps. There's no incremental steps between being formless and having arms and legs and smiling.
Goes back to the jati.
Yes. The cause is the jati. The universal is the cause. Yes, exactly. So what we've just discussed is the fallacy of reductionism. So we're going to summarize what we've just been discussing, that reductionism is a complete fallacy, and the reason it's a fallacy is because the causes are inseparable from each other. Remember, Francis Bacon said we'll bracket off this and we'll bracket off that, we'll just deal with these two causes. But to do that, he had to redefine them in a crude and childish way, actually, because they're actually inseparable. So if you look at this, let's say there's an object here. The object is this circular thing. And so what it's made of is the ingredient. The ingredient is formless. It's a potential, but it's given form. But in order for it to be given form, there has to be an instrumental cause outside of that form that invests or actualizes the potential into the form. So instrumental cause. So we would say that God is the instrumental cause of all forms. And that is, we'll come to that. That's in the first line of Srimad Bhagavatam. God is the instrumental cause of the form, and the form has an ingredient, but that was a pure potential. Now, because the ingredient was a pure potential, the effect that this form has on other things can't be down to its parts, because the idea that everything is made of parts or can be reduced to parts is just in your mind. It's just that things can just be reduced ultimately to one last part is in your mind. It's a vikalpa, it's an imagination arising from ignorance. Avidya Maya Kalpita in Srimad Bhagavatam is the idea that there's one last fundamental form is an imagination born from ignorance. And so, because the power that the form has on something else can't be reduced to a micro-constituent because that was your imagination, therefore it must be inherent in the form itself. So the power that a form has to act on something else is called the teleological cause. It's telos. That's its own power to produce an effect. And when it produces that effect on something else, then that's instrumental cause. Understand? So what you have here, you have a situation where the ingredient, the form, the final cause, and the instrument are all there in one object and can't be separated. You can't have a form without an ingredient. You can't have a form which isn't the substrate of teleological effects. And that form can't be an instrumental cause on anything else unless it's the substrate of teleological effects. So instrument, teleology, form, and ingredient, the four causes, they're completely inseparable. They're only inseparable in your imagination. And when you have an idea which doesn't correspond with reality, that is called vikalpa. Vikalpa, imagination. And when you make an imaginary idea and you don't notice that you've done it, it's called pramada. Brahm itself is one type of vikalpa. Brahm itself is one type of vikalpa. And pramada is when you do one vikalpa on top of another and you don't even notice that you're doing it. So there are layers of mistake, layers of inattentiveness. And this is why, because the conditioned soul, due to turning away from God, becomes buried in layer after layer of vikalpa, imagination, and he doesn't even notice it due to pramada, inattentiveness. That's why no one can get out of the material world. So, but did anyone catch this? The inseparability, they only can be separated in your mind, but not in reality. Right? So now we're not at Vedanta yet, but we're going to start to get there. Because you can see, if all causes are inseparable and they're connected to another cause and another one, ultimately nothing is separate from God. So we'll be moving into non-dual consciousness. We're still in dual consciousness right now. And that's the fault of the classical worldview. That's one of the faults in it. But it's a necessary step to remove our misconceptions and take this step gradually towards understanding Vedanta, or the state of non-dual consciousness. So just to summarize here, You may say, well, is this anywhere in scripture? I never read this before. So let me just introduce you to the very first line of Srimad Bhagavatam. In the first line of Srimad Bhagavatam, it said, Janma jasya yatanvaya eteratascha bhigya swarat. Not even going to touch the second line. So Janmadi, the word Janma means, Janmadhyasya means God is that person who gives birth to the whole universe. So the word Janma, to give birth, means to invest something with jati, with a form. So Janmadhyasya yata means God is the formal cause of the world. Anvayad, the word Anvayad means He's directly the cause of the world. So if you look in the commentary of Vishwanath Thakur, he said the word Anvayat means upadan. Look at the bottom. Upadan. Upadan is a Sanskrit word for ingredient cause. Then the word itara in Sanskrit means the other one. So when you say Anvaya itara, you mean the ingredient cause, and the other, that means nimitta. So all the acharyas said itara means nimitta karan, that's instrumental cause. Cha arteshu, and arta means what? Like dharma arta, it's the objectives. In other words, the potential to produce effects or attain a particular result. So the word arta means telos, or final cause. So the four cause, that's the first thing in Srimad Bhagavatam. Janmadhyasya yatanvaya literatascha tishrabhiga swarat. God is the formal cause, the ingredient cause, the instrumental cause, and the teleological cause of everything. It's the first thing. But because we were raised in the modern milieu, in the modern atmosphere of mechanistic reductionism, that makes us handicapped and incapable of understanding our own philosophy. And so the way to undo that misconception is you have to go back to the classical stage first, just to undo the misconception. And then from there you can come to Vedanta. Understand? Okay. So in the last word here in the first line of Shiva is swarat. So swarat means, where are we? Okay. So swarat means self-existent. God is fully independent. So everything is dependent on Him. He is self-existent. So that which is self-existent is omnipotent. And only God is self-existent, just like we gave the example, the violin player is playing the music. The music exists as long as the violin player is playing. If he stops playing, the music disappears. So similarly, everything existence only exists because God's Shakti is making it exist by His will. And if He were to will it so, then nothing would exist. And that's what literally happens to the material world at the time of the destruction. He no longer wants the world to exist and everything is dissolved. So, this is the first line of Srimad Bhagavatam. Janmadhyasya yatanvaya ditaratascha swabhigya swarat. The Supreme Lord is the formal cause, He's the ingredient cause, He's the instrumental cause, He is the final cause of everything. The ultimate goal is Krishna Prem, His service. And He is Swarat, is the only independent being. So the entirety of natural theology and the entirety of all the classical Greek theology is discussed, explained, and complete in the first line of Srimad Bhagavatam. But perhaps you didn't see it. And the reason was the conditioning of modernity. So we'll stop there. In the evening, I won't make you work so hard. I can see the smoke is coming out of the right here. It's kind of like a high voltage transfer. The resistors are smoking now. So in the evening, we'll just have some little philosophy, mainly Gaur Leela, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's pastimes, Krishna's pastimes. But you should know, Siddhanta Boliya Chitinako Alas, Jahoiti Krishna Lagi Sudrida Manas. Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami said, when it comes to understanding Siddhanta, don't be lazy. It's hard work. It's not easy. It's difficult. It takes a great deal of effort. But Jahoite Krishna Lagi Sudrida Manas. If you take the effort to understand Siddhanta, then your mind will become steady and you will become fixed on Krishna. So this evening it will be very easy. Don't run away. Beautiful pastimes of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Krishna. But tomorrow morning we'll extend this to complete this discussion, because there are wonderful things. It leads to non-dual consciousness, and it leads ultimately to the only thing that matters: the glories of the holy name. Hare Nam, Hare Nam, Hare Nam Eva Kevalam. There is only the holy name, the holy name, the holy name. Because ultimately that's what Vedanta is. All Vedanta is just leading us to the glories of the holy name. So, but we won't arrive there today. We'll arrive there tomorrow morning. Gaur Premanande.